Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our virtual walk in the trees this morning. My name is Jessie, and I'm the Director of Marketing and Communications here at Greenbelt Alliance. For those of you who aren't familiar with our work, our mission is to educate, advocate, and collaborate to ensure the Bay Area's lands and communities are resilient to a changing climate. Now, if that mission sounds new to some of you who've known us for a while, that's because we recently released a new strategic plan, which I encourage you to check out on our website at greenbelt.org/strategic-plan. And with that, I'll hand it over to Ken, our fabulous leader of our outings program. Take it away, Ken.
Okay. I thought a good place to start before we all drop off here and decide it's a lost cause is with one of the more common trees and one that we all recognize, the big leaf maple. And this isn't the same maple that we get maple syrup from, and it's not the leaf that's on the Canadian flag. This is Acer macrophyllum. It's our version of the tree. Real distinctive leaves. You never forget the maple tree. But what's really nice is those of us that are transplants from back east, well, we always complain about the lack of fall color in the Bay Area. Well, here's a tree that is a remedy to that. This changes a great yellow color in the fall. And if we were paying attention way back in science class, we might remember how that happens. With our deciduous trees, before they drop their leaves in winter, they try to withdraw all the valuable nutrients that they can use again next summer. Nitrogen and magnesium and others. So they start to do that, and they stop feeding the pigments. And the least stable pigment of all is chlorophyll. That's the first to go. So then we see the others that were there all along, but just masked by the chlorophyll. The yellow color is a pigment called xanthophyll, and the orange color is a carotenoid pigment like in carrots. But finally, they're all gone and the leaves drop. Now in the springtime, now obviously this isn't a big leaf maple, but in most trees, when the leaves first come out, they're reddish colored, and you wonder what's going on there. Well, that's a different pigment altogether than anthocyanin. It's a red pigment, and it protects the new leaf from getting sunburned, being damaged by ultraviolet light before it has a chance to harden up. And that anthocyanin also tastes terrible, so it keeps animals from eating the tasty young leaves. But the most important thing, the thing that we might remember about the big leaf maple are the little winged fruits, the seeds. They're called samaras. And remember when you were a kid, you used to pick those and you could twirl them and they'd fly away like a helicopter. I could never do that. Mine went straight down to the ground, but that's the general idea. And when you have seeds that are dispersed by the wind, there's actually a name for that. It's called anemochory. Remember, an anemometer measures the wind, so it's anemochory. So you're walking along the trail and enjoying the fall colors as the leaves fall to the ground. But then all of a sudden, all around you, there's green leaves from not a maple, a different kind of tree. And you wonder what's going on. Who didn't get the memo about fall? Well, it turns out that tree is a big leaf maple. Not a big leaf maple, it's a white alder. Red alders live near the coast, white alders are inland, but they drop their leaves green. So what's going on? Well, alders usually live creekside, and creeks flood often and wash away soil. So the trees have great adaptation. They've formed a partnership. They have little nodules on their roots, and in those roots live nitrogen-fixing bacteria. The little bacteria can split nitrogen in the air spaces in the soil so that the tree can attach it to things like ammonium ions and others, and it makes its own food. So it's a great example of climate sustainability. the alder. It doesn't have to bother with withdrawing nutrients from its leaves. Well, another tree that you might find along a waterway is probably familiar to most of us. It's a willow. And we have lots and lots of different species of willows in the Bay Area. I won't try to distinguish them all, but remember the poem about the willow trees? Rushes are round, sedges have edges, willows are water-bound. So whenever you see a willow tree, you know you're pretty close to water. Really distinctive lance-shaped leaves. And in the springtime, they flower. Well, if you're a willow tree, you're either a male or a female. And it's not like a dog. You can't look underneath the tree to see which it is. You have to wait till it flowers, and then you check the flowers. The yellow flowers, the pollen flowers, those are on the male trees. That's on the left there. And the green, those are the females. And the easy way to remember, just remember green for Mother Earth. The willow tree is actually, well, it's the host plant for this guy, the morning cloak butterfly. And this, I believe, is the longest, the overwintering generation of the morning cloak is the longest lived butterfly that there is, even longer than those monarch butterflies that overwinter in the eucalyptus trees. And in early springtime, if you're walking along a stream canyon, for example, Mitchell Canyon, Mount Diablo, and you manage to hit the right day when it's just the first really warm day, the whole canyon will be alight with these morning cloak butterflies. Well, later in the year, you might think the tree is finally going into puberty because it's starting to get pimples, but that's not exactly true. What's happening is those are called galls, G-A-L-L, and they're caused by little insects, usually a type of solitary wasp called a cynipid wasp, about the size of a gnat. That's what it looks like. And some of the wasps have little egg layers, little ovipositors that look like saws. So the wasp that did this was called a sawfly. And mama wasp flies to the leaf. There's hundreds of little insects that make galls. Each one has a favorite type of tree, a favorite part of the tree, and a distinctive shape. So this particular one, the willow apple gall, she'll sawfly, she'll fly to the leaf, she'll stick her egg layer in and lay an egg. And at the same time, she injects some fluids that stimulate the tree to start to grow this little structure. And it covers the egg. And when the egg hatches, baby starts to chew, the little larva, and of course, babies drool. There's chemicals in the little baby wasp's saliva that tell the tree to send food and water to the gall. So now it's got a home and it's got a continuous source of food and water. And when the wasp has gone through its various life stages and it's an adult, it'll chew its way out and fly off, and the willow tree is none the worse for wear. But as you pass by your willow trees, you might see something that looks a bit more serious, a rather rampant act of vandalism. What's going on here? Who scraped away all that bark? Well, that's the culprit. That's our, there's a buck of our local mule deer, Colombian mule deer. And of course, the bucks grow their antlers every year. And by springtime, they're covered in velvet. They're growing. The velvet's full of blood vessels to nourish the antlers as they grow. And once they're done growing, though, the velvet starts to dry, the blood flow stops, and the antlers with the velvet on them become very sore and itchy, and the deer is desperate to rub that off. And the deer look for a soft bark tree. And if there's willows around, that's the tree of preference. And the reason is in willow bark, there's a substance called salinan, which relieves pain. And it's long been known by Native Americans and also by Europeans for the species of willow that grow over there and in Asia that chewing on willow bark relieves pain. But nobody had a really convenient solution for how to isolate that until 1896, when a German chemist working for a pharmaceutical company was able to finally extract salicin crystals from willow bark. And he set to work, and 2 years later, his product was on the market. He had acetylsalicylic acid and Bayer aspirin. And that was the original source for aspirin, the willow bark, and the salicylic acid in willow bark. Well, another great California tree is the California buckeye. Now, Ohio is known as the Buckeye State, but we've got our own buckeye. It's really not closely related to the Ohio buckeye at all. And it's an interesting tree. It starts to get its leaves with the winter rains. And then in the height of summer, it drops its leaves. So you might figure it's got the California climate figured out. The growing season here is really late winter and spring, and nothing much happens when it dries out in the summer. And this tree has got some great adaptations. Though botanists think really it's just drought sensitive. It's not that smart, but we can be charitable to the tree. So these trees, they've already have their buds, so they're just waiting for it to rain, which may be next week, and then they'll start to leaf out. And the leaves are very distinctive. They look like a hand, palmate. They've even got 5 fingers with that compound leaf. And then a little later in the springtime, the real highlight occurs. The trees get their flowers. They get long stalks of flowers. And they're great. They smell like perfume. And they're pollinated by butterflies and moths. They're often visited by honeybees, but here's the thing, the pollen and possibly the nectar poisonous to honeybees. Honeybees are not native to the United States. They were brought over, remember, in the 17th century for honey by the Pilgrims. And they spread it all across North America. But when they visit this tree, they're in for a nasty surprise. I've had beekeepers tell me that they've seen some of their dead bees in a circle around the bottom of a buckeye tree. But it's interesting, now they're considered the main pollinator of buckeyes. They can't help themselves. And there's a beehive that we visit on some of our walks up Mitchell Canyon on Mount Diablo that is just a few yards away from buckeye trees. And the bees are all over that with seemingly no ill effects. So it's either there's some populations of honeybees that have developed a resistance to the buckeye, or they're suicidal. You can take your choice. Well, it turns out that on the flower stalks, all those flowers you're looking at, they're almost all female. Well, they're almost all male, sorry. There's just a handful of female flowers. The males are just there for show, to put on a pretty face. And the reason is, well, the buckeye has the largest fruit, the largest nut of any native California tree. They're gigantic. The settlers used to call them California pears. And if all those little flowers had female parts and they all got pollinated and fertilized, the branch would break. They're so heavy. So usually only a few are female. Here they are starting to develop. And there's quite a few on here, but it turns out only 1 or 2 or maybe 3 will grow up. The rest will be, there's chemical in the tree once the others start to get going, get a head start. There's chemicals that suppress the growth in the other female flowers. Then comes summer and the tree drops its leaves, but the fruits keep developing. And then about this time, they start to split open, and that's how the tree got its name. Looks like a deer's eye winking at you, hence buckeye. Now, even though they're called California pears, they're not edible. They're actually deadly poisonous. They've got alkaloid in them and glycosides and a sudsing component called saponin. But what the Native Americans used to do, they'd harvest the buckeyes and they'd grind them up and then toss them into ponds to stupefy the fish or knock them out, and they'd come floating to the surface. And of course, with the first rains, there the nuts fall to the ground and start to sprout. And pretty soon you have all the little buckeyes sprouting. Now they won't all survive, but it makes a great sight in the winter when very little else is blooming. Well, if you had to take a vote for the prettiest tree in the Bay Area, well, most people I think would vote for madrone. And nobody would claim the election is fixed. The madrone is the tree with the beautiful red bark. Madrone means strawberry in Spanish. And it looks quite a bit like manzanita, which is a shrub in the same family. You can think of madrone as a manzanita on steroids. They have broad, thick leaves and edible, well, red berries that are loved by birds. Now, I'm not sure of their edibility to humans. I mean, they're not poisonous. People ask, is something edible or is it poisonous? Well, there's a grade in between there called palatable. So it's not poisonous. I'm not sure how palatable this is to human taste. But the most distinctive thing about the tree is, again, the bark. It's got peely bark, and botanists have long puzzled over what's going on here. One idea is it's just a way to keep nasty freeloaders off, like fungus. Others think that, well, maybe that's just the way it grows. We'll see in a minute that some trees flex when they grow, the bark flexes and develops fissures, but this one peels. But notice it's green where it's just peeled. So the most recent idea is that, well, madrones are beautiful trees, but they tend to get outcompeted by oaks and bay trees, and they have a tough time getting light. So they tend to peel on the upward facing or the sun facing side of the tree. They do their peeling mostly in late spring. So they're naked by summer to do their summer nude sunbathing. And the idea is that greenish color comes from little chloroplasts in the trunk, little photosynthesizing cells, so that any light that misses a leaf and hits the trunk, it gets utilized by the tree. Now, the big benefit to us of the tree peeling like that is that on a hot day, when you feel like you're about to keel over and you're really perspiring, you just find a madrone tree and give it a good hug, because the outer bark is peeled away, the little vesicles, the xylem that carries water, very close to the surface. So you just give a hug to the tree and it cools you right off. The kids all call it the refrigerator tree. And the tree was actually first scientifically collected and described way back in the 1790s during the Voyage of Discovery. Now, the Voyage of Discovery was a series of voyages down the west coast of North America from what's now British Columbia to Baja California, led by this man, the captain, George Vancouver. And George, in the olden days, you had a ship surgeon aboard, and the surgeon, well, he was supposed to do duty also as the naturalist when the ship went into port. Sometimes it was reversed. You had a naturalist on board and he was supposed to do the doctoring duties. You know, if I was a sailor, I kind of prefer the former rather than the latter. And it turned out that George Vancouver had a real doctor on board. His name was Archibald Menzies. And though he was the surgeon, he took his job seriously, his collecting job. And he often tried to leave the ship when it was in port, but that irritated Vancouver to no end. At one point, Vancouver took away Menzies' lab assistant and made the lab assistant a deckhand. Another time he had poor Dr. Menzies thrown in the ship's brig when he tried to leave port. But he persevered and he was able to collect some. He was also able to leave a great record so that those that followed him, like David Douglas, knew where to look for many of these things. And the scientific name for the madrone is Arbutus menzesii, after Dr. Menzies. And decades later, when David Douglas explored the West Coast, he asked some of the natives and whether they remember Dr. Menzies. And they said, oh yes, we remember him. He was that red-faced fella that cut off men's limbs and collected grasses. Great epitaph. Well, one of the trees that's one of our classic trees of the Oak Bay woodland would be California bay, the bay laurel. And it's not the same as the bay tree that you find, that you use in spices. Those bay leaves come from a relative that lives in the Mediterranean. So if you were going to use this tree for spices, you could, but you need to cut down the recipe by a half or 2/3. It's a distant relative of the avocado, as you can see by the nuts, the fruits here. It's one of the first trees, one of the first things to flower in late winter. So it's a very important food source for our native bees and other flying insects that have the temerity to start flying around while the weather is still cold. They really depend on the bay tree. But the most distinctive thing about the tree are the leaves. They kind of look like willow leaves, but all you have to do is smell them. And it's got that very strong aroma. It's got, well, it was used, it has anti-insect and antifungal properties and it has some analgesic properties. So it really was a useful tree. The Native Americans would pick bay leaves and use them to line baskets where they stored acorn flour to keep away the insects over winter. If you're having a picnic and you're bothered by flies and gnats, find a bay tree and have the picnic under the bay tree. It'll solve your flying nuisance problem. I don't think the bay tree does much for ants. If you got a headache and there are no willow trees handy, just pick a few bay leaves, bind them to your temples or rub them on your forehead. It should get rid of your headache, possibly give you one if you don't already have one. And if you catch a cold from being outdoors on a winter day, take a bay leaf, make a tiny little tear. Make a tear in the side of the leaf there, and if you stick it up your nose, just like Vicks Vapor Rub, you can breathe just fine. And it generally improves your appearance, but not in all cases. Biologists studying dusky-footed wood rats who make these huge nests in the trees were amazed when they found out that these wood rats were collecting bay leaves off nearby bay trees. Usually the wood rats make their nests in the oaks nearby, but they were collecting leaves. They were tearing the leaves and lining the nests with bay leaves. And they would change them out, the bay leaves, every week or two to keep away fleas. So the scientists, they tried their own experiment. They collected some fleas, which must have been pleasant. And they used bay leaves, and not only did the leaves do away with the fleas, the bay leaves managed to kill 75% of the eggs. So next time you think about spending $50, $60 for a flea application for your dog or cat, you might want to consider bay leaves. Probably improve their smell too. Well, this is the coast live oak. which is kind of the iconic tree of the Bay Area. It's the most common tree in the Bay Area. This one, particular one, is on Mount Diablo. It's not the most common tree on Mount Diablo. This oak tree favors cooler and wetter climes, but you generally find it more towards the coast, hence the name coast live oak, but also inland. This is in Mitchell Canyon on Mount Diablo, and that little sign there says bicentennial tree, 1987. So it turned out that 1987 was the 200th anniversary of the ratification of the United States Constitution. And all through the parks in the country, it was thought to be a good idea to find trees that might have started growing about the time the Constitution was ratified. And on Mount Diablo, with all our different kinds of trees, they picked the coast live oak, and this one in Mitchell Canyon. So when you take a visit to Mount Diablo, you can look for the bicentennial tree. It's been here 200 years, and it'll probably be here another 200 years. The coast live oak, well, gave Oakland its name. That's the silhouette on the symbol for Oakland. So there's many species of oak trees in the Bay Area, and we won't try to identify them all because you can really go crazy trying to do that. Oak trees are wind pollinated and they tend to hybridize, which makes the job a little bit difficult. But with a coast live oak, well, what you want to look for, first, the leaves have bristles, these little thorns, these little stickers. And the correct name on oak trees is bristles. When a bristle, as opposed to a thorn or a sticker, the leaf margin, the vein, you need to get it close up and get a magnifying glass. It actually goes around a little sticky thing. So it's a bristle. So next time you're hiking with your friends and they tell you to watch out, don't get stuck by the sticker there, you can correct them and tell them it's a bristle, and they'll become very annoyed with you. And coast live oak leaves, well, people say they're canoe shaped. You'll never find them flat. They're always curled up. And some of the leaves have little tufts of hair at the vein margins. Now, look for the hairy armpits, but not all the leaves have them. Before you point that out to anybody, make sure first find the leaf with some hairy armpits, or else you'll be very embarrassed. This was good, but I cheated a little bit. This was at a parking lot at Brioni's Regional Park, so there was a little dust on the hairy armpits. No excuse for the dirty fingernails. And coast live oak, it flexes when it grows. And remember the madrone flaked and peeled? This one, as it grows, flexes. You can just think of a bodybuilder flexing his or her muscles. Well, one that grows further inland in hotter, drier, less hospitable, and with poor soil is one that sometimes gets mistaken for a coast live oak. This is a canyon live oak. And of course, live just refers to the fact that it's evergreen, it's not deciduous. So this you'll find in hotter, drier areas of the Bay, of our Bay Area. This is on Mount Olympia on Mount Diablo, and this is a canyon live oak. You never find a coast live oak, any self-respecting coast live oak growing out of a rock like this. And it so impressed John Muir that this is the tree that he called the sturdy pioneer. And this one has real interesting leaves. Some of them kind of look like coast live oak leaves. They have bristles, they're a bit curved, but some of them have actually absolutely smooth margins. It turns out, if you do a census of a tree, most of the smooth ones are higher up on the tree. The greater proportion of bristle leaves are down below, and that's thought to be a deterrent to browsers. They're not going to bite something that's going to stick them in the gums. And with canyon live oak, if you turn the leaf over, there's usually a whitish or a golden fuzz. This is another one of our oak trees that favors warmer, drier areas. It only grows in California, no place else in the world. This is the California black oak. This one has very distinctive leaves. It has big lobes and deep sinuses and bristles. And it's really, I think, the only oak that has the combination of the three. And it's famous for its acorns. Not that they're the biggest acorns, they're the best tasting acorns. That was the ones that were really favored by the Native Americans. They were the best tasting because they had the most oil and the most fat and probably the least amount of tannic acid. So you had to do the least amount of leaching. It was the least amount of trouble to prepare and the best tasting. The scientific name for the California black oak, Quercus kelloggi. Quercus is the genus name for oak trees. It just means fine tree in Celtic. You have to have at least one Irish reference for Jesse for every talk. So Quercus means fine tree in Celtic. And kelloggi refers to this fellow, Albert Kellogg, who had absolutely nothing to do with breakfast cereal. He was a physician, not on a ship, but he had a practice on the East Coast. And he was a very good doctor and a very bad businessman. He was so kind-hearted that if one of his patients he felt couldn't afford the fee, he wouldn't charge him. And he was really reluctant to hound anybody for what they owed him. So pretty soon his medical practice went belly up. And fortuitous for him, at least he thought, it was the same time as the California gold rush. So he headed out west and he tried his hand at gold mining, but he failed. So as many miners did, he headed towards San Francisco and he set up a practice there. And all the while he was indulging his favorite pastime, which was botany. He was a self-taught botanist and became very respected among what the Bay Area scientific community. He was one of the individuals that founded the California Academy of Sciences. And the California Academy of Sciences, well, at its founding, the people involved wanted to make it a little bit different than all those snooty East Coast academies. They wanted to invite everybody, whether you had a PhD in botany or not. If you had an interest in science and you wanted to volunteer or you wanted to apply for a paid position, that was great. They'd take you. So they were feeling quite proud of themselves. They had in their bylaws, we heartily invite all men with an interest in science to apply and join us. And Albert Kellogg took a look at those bylaws or whatever passes for incorporation of a nonprofit, a scientific academy. And he said, wait a minute, gentlemen, we're forgetting something. And he insisted that they add language, we heartily encourage all women to apply for membership in the academy and to apply for all jobs that they feel they are qualified for. And of course, the rest is history, because not too many years later, the famous botanist Alice Eastwood was hired by the Academy. And she was there for 50 years as the curator of the botanic collection, and several other women followed in her footsteps. And it was really all due to the foresight and the generosity of this man, Albert Kellogg. Well, this is another huge tree that you might mistake for the black oak, except where it grows. Unlike the black oak that can grow in dry areas, this is the valley oak, and it's a water spendthrift. You always see it growing by streams or creeks. There's actually a little stream down there. And if you don't, you know there's a very high water table underneath. This is one of the trees that, well, is really being threatened by climate change. And we're not doing much to help it. It loves to grow in floodplains, and that's where we're putting houses. And it's losing its habitat. And plus the drying climate is making it difficult for the trees. So it's estimated we could lose over 40% of our valley oaks in the next several decades. And it's really a bad idea to be building in floodplains. One of the things Greenbelt Alliance is working very hard on is to promote climate resiliency. And it's just a poor idea. You sooner or later going to get a flood. And that is, first you wipe out your oak trees, your natural environment. And then several years later, that's not a climate resilient community building in a floodplain and hampering our aquifers and groundwater. And again, take a look at our website to see all the many projects we're involved in. The leaves of the valley oak, well, they're huge, just like the black oak. They have lobes and deep sinuses, but they have no bristles. They have acorns. They've also got other stuff growing up in the trees. These are galls. Remember the tiny little leaf gall that we saw? Turns out this gall that grows on the twigs and the branches of a valley oak, it's the largest gall in the world. It's called an oak apple, but don't try to eat it. It's full of tannic acid. You'll spit it right out. So these are all have one little baby in it, probably all laid by the same female. And it's interesting, you kind of trace the development. The green ones are new, they started to grow. And then further down is one that's a bit older. And this one, they've all flown off. Remember, once, as long as that little critter is in there and salivating, the tree sends food and water, and once it's gone, they turn brown and black. So again, botanists tell us it really doesn't stress the tree, but might have a hard time convincing this poor tree of that. It looks like it's been festooned by Christmas ornaments. Because these guys are so big, these particular galls, you get a lot of action in there. I mean, it's like too attractive. The original baby pretty soon has company because there's another series of wasps that come by called the inquiline wasps or the tenant wasps. And that female will stick her ovipositor in and lay an egg or two. And when they hatch, well, they really don't bother the original baby in there, but they freeload. They eat the food that's in there and the other nourishment. So they're like a guest that comes over uninvited and heads to the refrigerator and doesn't leave till she's eaten you out of house and home. But then there's a third type of wasp called the parasitoid wasp. That sounds ominous, and it is. She sticks her ovipositor in, and when that hatches, you can guess what that little guy tries to do. Eat everybody else, but usually, as you can see here, many get out. What they used to, in the mission days, the padres would collect these once they turned dry like this. They'd grind them up, stick them in a bottle of water with a piece of rusty metal, stick it out in the sun, come back in a few weeks, and voila, you'd have oak gall ink. And you'd use that ink to write your reports back to Mexico City. So this is written with oak gall ink. And Isabel here wants to remind me she's holding her bouquet of lichen. Oftentimes on oak trees and many other trees, we get to see lichen growing. And if you remember back to your camp days or maybe your high school days or earlier, lichen is a symbiotic relationship between two little organisms. One is a fungus. Fungus is holding on to the tree without harming it. The fungus is taking moisture and minerals out of the atmosphere, but a fungus can't make its own food. So growing with the fungus is a tiny little algae. The algae takes all the ingredients that the fungus collects and is protected by the fungus from drying out or getting too hot or too cold. And it does the cooking, it does the photosynthesizing and shares with the fungus. And there's two poems to help you remember the relationship. Alice Algae took a lichen to Freddy Fungus. Freddie was a fungi. He really went out on a limb. And the people in the North Bay have their own version. When algae and fungus got married, their wedding photographer tarried. He came with his Nikon, took a picture of lichen, and plant life became further varied. Well, turns out it's not all that simple, at least in the last few years. It's really hard to keep up with all the new ideas and theories. One of the newest is discovered by a self-taught botanist, a la Albert Kellogg. He was looking at lichen and he discovered that in every lichen, there's actually two different kinds of fungi. So there's two fungi and an algae. So it's actually a menage a trois, I guess. Another botanist became puzzled. He or she looked very carefully at all the different types of fungi involved in lichen. He found that none of those species that are involved are free living anymore. They can't make it on their own. They have to have that algo partner. But the botanists also found that all the algae involved, they do just fine by themselves. In mild climates, they can't live where it's hot or very cold or very dry without the fungus to protect them. But in mild climates, they do just fine. So the idea is now, this is more a controlled parasitic relationship. That fungus is farming the algae. Kind of wrecks the poem, doesn't it? And what about the tree? Well, it was long thought that the tree just didn't care one way or the other. That was what we learned was a commensalism. The lichen benefited and the tree wasn't harmed or wasn't benefited at all, but that's not true because some of the algae involved in lichen, it's a blue-green algae, cyanobacteria. It's a nitrogen fixer. And the thought is that that algae in the lichen is passing nitrogen to the tree through a variety of methods. So the tree's quite happy to have the lichen on there. The trees liken the relationship. That's kind of lame. I stole that from a third grader in one of my classes. So since 2006, California is the only state in the United States, in the Union, to have an official state lichen. And it's this one. It's lace lichen, the lichen that hangs down and looks like a fishnet. Ramalina menzii. There's Dr. Menzies again. And lichen, it's actually an indicator of clean air. Lichen won't grow where the air is polluted, where there's sulfur dioxide. So wherever you see lichen growing, you know the air is still clean. And many types of lichen have things in them that are antimicrobial chemicals and antibacterial. So lichen turns out it's quite the basic organism, but very beneficial and unique. One last thing. Sometimes you see this growing from oak trees and other types of trees. This is mistletoe. And the jury is kind of out on this too. There's been some recent discoveries. Now there's two types, broad categories of mistletoe. There's the type of mistletoe that grows in conifers and pine trees that we just don't have time for today. That'll have to be another day. That's kind of nasty. That's a total parasite. But there's the broadleaf mistletoe, the common mistletoe that grows in oak trees and other broadleaf trees. This is only a partial parasite, a hemiparasite. It has green leaves. It can photosynthesize just fine. Its problem is that its roots, it can't stick its roots in the ground anymore. So it has to stick them, its hausteria sticks them into tree branches and it steals food and water. So a hemiparasite. How did we ever get from a hemiparasite to kissing under that same organism? Well, for that one, you have to go way back to the British Isles, back to the time of the Druids. And the Druids worshipped oak trees. And they became very disturbed and uneasy and upset in the wintertime when all the oak trees dropped their leaves, but they were very relieved to see there was still something green on the oak trees. It was the mistletoe. They thought the mistletoe was preserving the life force of the tree over the winter. So they attributed magical and mystical and medicinal properties to the mistletoe. And it was a short step there to kissing under the mistletoe for good luck. But mistletoe, this broadleaf mistletoe, even though it is not great for the oak trees, it's very important for the natural world. There are butterflies and moths that depend on this mistletoe. It's the host plant. So they need to lay their eggs on the mistletoe. Those berries are a food source, and it's the main food source for this bird, the western bluebird, during certain times of the year. And this, the western bluebird is a cavity nester. It's been having its own problems and probably kept lately, and it's probably kept afloat by the mistletoe. So it's kind of a mixed bag. It's good for the environment, but the poor oak tree is like taking one for the team. But you know, oak trees, they can go a long way with mistletoe on them. And usually they can cope with some mistletoe. In times of drought, which are becoming more frequent with climate change, then it's a problem because there's less water. And the tree becomes stressed, and then the mistletoe can actually hasten the tree's demise. This poor tree looks like it's mostly mistletoe. But you know what they say about oak trees, they live for 100 years and then they die for 100 years. So I'm guessing this tree may survive all our collective lifetimes despite the mistletoe. And just one more tree to go through. And it's another one that lives only in California, no place else in the world. It's a cousin to the valley oak, but this tree lives where it's hot and dry. It's a drought tree. It's called the blue oak. And you really can't see the bluish color very well here, but it has thick, waxy leaves. And by late summer, those thick, waxy leaves kind of give it a bluish green tinge. But here's another one that's really threatened by climate change. Again, we could lose nearly half of our blue oaks by the end of the century. This tree lives on the edge in hot, dry places that other trees and other oak trees can't survive. And when you live on the edge, it doesn't take much to push you over. So further drying and further warming of the climate really could do in these trees. And that leaves a lot of dead wood. When we build in hillsides amidst our blue oak forest, that doesn't do much for the trees. It's also a ticking time bomb for fires amidst the dead and the dying trees. So definitely that's not how you build climate resilient communities. And one of our great policy people, Terry Shore, is working very hard to help preserve urban limit lines and community separators up in the North Bay to lessen the risk of fire and to help preserve these trees. These leaves, usually pretty small, they do have tiny little lobes. That's an adaptation to the heat. And interesting, if you can get out there in the middle of summer when it's 90 and 100 degrees out in our warmer areas, notice that the leaves on the blue oaks, they're all pointed edgewise. They orient edgewise towards the sun to try to avoid full sunlight. They're the very first trees to get going once it rains. Try to get a head start where there's still moisture in the soil. Blue oaks, the scientific name, Quercus douglasii, named for David Douglas, who was really the premier botanist in Western North America. His first voyage in the 1820s was to the Pacific Northwest, and he collected many, many species of plants, hundreds of species. He had a really tough time. He was lonely and the weather was tough on him. And one of the first plants he discovered was poison oak, which probably didn't help matters much. His second voyage was to California in 1830. And that was a lot better. He remarked that the climate was great, the senoritas were beautiful, and the wine was tasty. And he had the poor Menzies problem figured out. He had the Hudson's Bay Company drop him off. And then he did his botanizing. He returned to Monterey with his collections, and he would stow them aboard another ship that came in for the Hudson's Bay Company to take back to England, so he didn't have to deal with any cranky captains. But in his first voyage in 1830, as he was preparing to leave the ship, well, he didn't quite leave in time. Now remember what I said, if you were a physician on board, if you're the ship's surgeon like Menzies, you had to be the botanist. But if you were the botanist, you were suspected to do the doctoring too while you're aboard ship. And the word got out that a ship had docked in Monterey with a scientist on board. And David Douglas looked out through one of the portholes, and sure enough, there was a line of local citizens waiting to see him with their medical complaints. So that must have been quite the sight. Well, he rolled up his sleeves. He said, well, if I can patch up a sore on a tree and I can graft some twigs, maybe I can do this. And many years later, an old man was asked about David Douglas, and he said, oh yes, when I was a little boy, I broke my arm and Mama took me to see Dr. Douglas. And he set my arm and he did such a great job, but he was so nice. And that must have been true, because for the 2 or 3 years afterwards that David Douglas traveled through California, everywhere he went, he was greeted as Dr. Douglas. So that's our coast live oak. And if you can get out, they still are holding their leaves. And my favorite thing about this tree, the blue oak, has the very, very nicest leaf galls of any tree. These are all from the blue oak. The top left is a dunce cap gall, and the saucer gall in the middle, and the little one on the right is a sea urchin gall. So still have time to get out. And next year we'll have Greenbelt Alliance outings to see some of these things. So that's it.
Thank you so much, Ken. And we did have some questions come in during your presentation, so I'm going to help field those now. The first question came from Pam Wong, and Pam asked, how is the tree, any tree, able to withstand the hot sunshine in the summertime without burning like we would?
So, well, the ones that are inland with the hot sun, as I mentioned, the blue oak tends to develops thick waxy leaves, and it tends to be able to move its leaves so they're being hit edgewise towards the sun, and they don't get the full sun. But other trees, they don't try it, like the coast live oak. Other trees are more inland trees. But some of the madrone stands it has thick waxy leaves. So it's either waxy leaves, or like the buckeye will drop its leaves. It won't even try to survive our summers. So they do have their adaptations like that.
Great. And Pam also asked, can you suggest 3 areas within 30 miles of the Bay Area for viewing fall colors?
Well, good place riparian places are good fall colors. So you have to find a creek. And you can see sycamores are turning, and not the alders, of course, and the maples and the cottonwoods. So the riparian trees all turn color. Being deciduous, these trees all have relatives. Their ancestors are all from colder climates. They're all from back east. You really don't have to lose your leaves in the Bay Area, but that's something that they've inherited from back east. And we don't get the great New England winter of fall colors. That's a bit different. That red is that same pigment that we get in the springtime, that anthocyanin, that red pigment. Because that red pigment is in those eastern trees to try to protect the leaves from the very cold nights when it's withdrawing some of the minerals. So we don't get that brilliant red color, but just about any park with a creek that runs through it will have the riparian trees that are turning color.
Great.
So Mount Diablo Mitchell Canyon is great.
And Isabel made a comment. Isabel Wade said, non-natives have lots of color. Come up to Sonoma. So there you go.
Yeah, I know. Well, that's cheating.
Yeah. We have another question that asked, This is from an anonymous attendee who asked, "Are bay leaves named after being native to the Bay Area?"
I don't think so. Forgot to mention they only grow in California and Oregon, and in Oregon they're called uh, myrtle,
Mm.
and they sell products to tourists made out of myrtle wood. They call it myrtle wood, and the big selling point is they only grow in Oregon and one other place in the world. Of course, they don't tell them the other place in the world is most of California, and the scientific name is Umbularia californica.
Gotcha. All right. And Mary asked, or yeah, commented, "I thought the third partner in lichen was a yeast."
Yes, I was told that's right, exactly. And I was told by our mushroom expert it's a type of fungus. And I didn't argue with her. That's it. You got it.
Perfect. And then I also have a question from Terry, our very own Terry Shore,
Uh-oh.
who said, "I thought it was called Oregon blue oak and lives in Oregon," when you were talking about the blue oak.
Oh, those Oregonians, they're no, the Quercus douglasii, I think is native, is endemic to California. The Oregonians might have their own. They say they have a few buckeye too, of our California buckeye, but botanists think that the Oregonians planted them up there. So they're under suspicion for that too.
Those darn Oregonians.
Yes.
All right. Well, I think that's it for questions. We will be sending out a follow-up email that includes a link to the recording of this webinar. So look out for that in your inbox later today. And then also, I just want to encourage folks to sign up for our next virtual outing, Rock Parks of Berkeley, with our board member, Bob Johnson, and that's coming up on December 12th. So until then, we hope everyone has a wonderful Thanksgiving and enjoys this lovely fall season, and we will see you again soon. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.